Welcome to Technomics, a podcast that explores the intersection of technology and the economy. Hosted by Robyn and Jeremy Nelson, Technomics is brought to you by Insight. The host's opinions, while mostly brilliant, are their own.
Hello, welcome to Technomics. We have come to the end of 2015 with just the holidays staring us down and the new year looming so close on the horizon. How are you, Jeremy?
I'm doing well, Robyn. How are you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. I am way behind on my holiday preparedness planning, but largely in part because I've been paying so much attention to, summing up 2015.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is we look back at everything that's gone on in 2015, everything that's going on for the next few weeks, it's easy to see how you can get behind. So along with being behind, just like you are, clearly battling a cold, so apologies to everyone listening, and the oddness of my voice for this recording.
I would be lying if I said I hadn't been there. In an effort to make sure that Jeremy doesn't have to talk too much, but that we do our level best to encapsulate what a big year it was, we thought we'd do a quick 2015 in review, capturing the biggest stories and trends that we heard about in this calendar year. So for us, as we talked through some of what's been going on, started to realize that it broke down into a few really interesting buckets. So the first bucket we want to tackle, starting with the A's, is acquisitions, breakups, and mergers.
Yeah, there's a lot happening this year, especially when we look at some of the old guard, what we would consider in the technology industries, the HPs of the world, the Dells of the world, looking all the way back to the dot-com days of the late 90s. So a lot of the names that we're going to be talking about here in this list really have their throws back to that particular era of technology innovation.
I remember hearing some talk of this for some time, the marketplace, the economic spectrum is kind of ripe for this kind of business activity to begin with. And I think what you're seeing is those legacy names, those foundational technology companies making a play for people and ideas and even some hardware in order to compete in this new disrupted universe.
Absolutely. When you think about companies that come from an era where it was acceptable to have a new product launch every year, every 18 months, maybe even every couple of years, to the point where now you have organizations that are completely cloud-based that are continuing to iterate, and you're having to deal with new feature sets, new competition on a weekly or monthly basis. It's really challenging for an organization like that to adapt, and you can't just keep doing the same old and think you're going to remain dominant.
So let's rattle off a few of the really big ones that happened. Arguably the biggest acquisition of the year, indeed what some have said is the biggest tech acquisition to date of all time, is Dell and EMC.
Huge, right? Especially when we talk about it in the context of Dell was, one of the major players in both personal computing as well as on the data center side, struggling to remain relevant in this public cloud-driven environment. And so with the acquisition of EMC comes along with it, obviously, a storage component, which was their core business. But along for the ride comes VMware, the subsidiary of EMC, one of the major players within the virtualization space, both when you talk about hypervisor for networking as well as compute. So now you're looking at that kind of software defined, as we talked about with Russell a few weeks ago. And then you couple that with the VCE component of it as well. And now you're talking about hyper-converged, private cloud.
Yeah, it's despite its largeness, this is a deal that I think it's wise in the agility that it actually creates for Dell.
Absolutely. And EMC. I think EMC needed someone with vision and drive beyond what they had, just a few months ago. Obviously they did have VCE, they did have VMware, they made some very astute acquisitions, and they were smart enough to let them run autonomously and continue to develop and innovate within the industry the way that they did. But the challenge is continuing to remain relevant when everything is now being focused out on public cloud and things that are now very open or very self-made and aren't necessarily reliant on some of the old traditional technologies.
So sticking with the theme of these company acquisitions or breakups for agility, on the other side of that coin is HP. A really big news story this year with the split for HP Inc. and HP Enterprise.
Yeah.
HPE.
HPE and HP Inc.
So, that's another really interesting one because, that divestiture as a way to remain lean really split into both the enterprise and then still the consumer space.
Yeah, and because HP is such a large organization that has so many things that they've brought to the table over the past couple of decades. Some of the biggest facing components that everyone sees from a day-to-day on a day-to-day basis is the HP printer that you have sitting at your desk at home or at the office, the HP either laptop, desktop that you work with, but then some of the other things that run in the background that people aren't necessarily as familiar with that help enterprises run and stay on top of their infrastructure, monitor, and continue to keep the lights on. So to potentially risk some of the strategic pieces of what is HP's business just so they can continue to put printer toner, into your house. It ends up being a very, very wise thing as we start transitioning away from, again, some of those those old ways of doing things that revolved around paper, that revolved around printing lots of things. There's obviously a need to transition to allow for that agile business or the business that can still remain relevant to continue on.
Well, the old joke about printers.
I do not.
Printer cartridge ink is the most expensive liquid on the planet.
It is.
And so, it's wise to maintain a way to keep that lucrative commodity.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I say this with complete sarcasm as somebody who has maybe been frustrated by a printer once or twice.
Well, have you ever gone out and bought a new printer because it was cheaper than buying the ink?
Yes, that is resonating a little too close to home. But the truth of the matter is, I don't have a printer anymore.
Not at all.
No.
Wow, That's impressive. I cannot say the same. I still have a printer.
I outsource my printing.
Wow, that's impressive.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about the next bucket of stories that dominated the conversation in 2015. And this wasn't just in the tech space. This was for all of us as people of Earth. And that is security breaches.
Yeah. And as we look back at the year, this was a unique year, I think, for security breaches. We coming out of 2014 with the huge hacks on like the Targets and the retailers of the world with, millions of credit card data being exposed. As we look at 2015, it was unique in its own right in the fact of we not only saw, the traditional credit card data, right, the high value stuff get compromised. We also saw Social Security information being leaked from a government entity. So now you have a whole nother level of personal information that can be used for identity theft out there, just kind of floating in that bad place, that dark net, if we want to call it. We also saw breaches escalate to what would traditionally be inanimate objects, but with the proliferation of technology into everyday, even some of the old school technology like vehicles, we've seen that the breaches escalate into areas where traditionally you wouldn't even think it possible.
Well, one of our very first episodes, we discussed the, oh my God, my car can get hacked phenomenon. That really blew my mind because you are suddenly thinking about these objects that are central to your daily routine as being vulnerable in that way. And that's a real paradigm shift. Mm-hmm. So that's huge. But, to your point, credit card information is pretty much table stakes now.
Yep.
Where it's really, I think the defining moments of this year have to do with how personal this is getting. You look at the OPM hack, the IRS hack, the Experian hack, the Blue Cross Blue Shield, the Anthem hack. These are Social Security details. These are health details. This is really striking at the heart of something totally different with completely different outcomes because it's not a black and white you have your money stolen from you, or you have a changed up credit score because somebody did something nefarious with that information. You have people with implicit biases that come as part of the human operating system, that, if that information is out there about you, about your health, about your, there's just, that is just so loaded. I don't think we've seen the end of this one yet. And there's been some interesting stories in the coverage of this topic over the course of the year about what are the long-term effects.
Oh, absolutely. And I think one thing is, over the past, we're coming up on 2 decades now of doing business over the internet. I think to a certain degree, most of us, most people who participate in, electronic transactions have at some point had a credit card be compromised. And it's almost become to the point where you just expect it, and there are safeguards put in where that your bank probably isn't going to hold you accountable, so those charges aren't going to be yours. It's a little bit of a hassle because you have to get a new card and potentially update systems for auto pays and things like that. But in the grand scheme of things, the direct impact to you as the individual is fairly limited. Now, you bubble that up to the enterprise, or those banks that actually secure those credit cards, the impact is pretty significant, as we saw with, like the Target breach from last year. But this is, like you said, is very, very different, because now it is very personal, the information that's being captured and potentially being sold, and what it could be potentially sold for. And that isn't something that most of us can necessarily just write off with, oh, someone else will take care of it for me, because it's something that will have a much more meaningful and direct impact on us as individuals.
Again, it just comes down to being so personal, and the outcomes of that are, it's a ripple effect outward, and you can't predict what some of those will be. But speaking of personal, we can't talk about breaches in 2015 without talking about the extremely personal Ashley Madison hack.
That ruined a few lives.
So that was, there are people out there who say that was noble work to expose some of those names. Obviously, the personal crises that ensued, there's some real questions about morality on both sides of that argument.
Yeah, absolutely. And it comes back to just that same question. I think it's an old, very old question, but, white hat, black hat type of hackers, people who hack for ethical reasons or for something that they believe in, or people who are looking to potentially just, kind of rob and steal. This one is more of a gray hat, I think. It's a very interesting story, and obviously got a lot of public attention.
And private, I would argue. But I think the through line to all of these is that in most instances, you're seeing a specialized marketplace appear for this. It's, there was a great statistic about what the cost of a credit card is on the black market, and it's next to nothing, whereas healthcare records are upwards of $50 per. So right there, you have a real inflation. And then some of this other hacking material, and I'll reference the CIA director's email getting hacked. You have this commentary for both this scenario and also Ashley Madison about, we will release more information. So, blackmail.
Oh, yeah.
Out and out blackmail.
Yeah, there's no question. The majority of that information, some of it can be used for identity theft, but obviously that only goes so far. As services kind of crop up to help protect against that type of thing, to monitor, oddly enough, Experian and
LastPass.
Yeah. So as we look at services like LifeLock and people, that are out there monitoring this actively to try and help and mitigate anyone taking advantage of that type of data or those types of situations, the real benefit is the intrinsic knowledge they can get about you as an individual and what they can get out of either you or somebody else for providing that information.
Those are some hefty thoughts. So we're going to pause on those hefty thoughts, though. And when we come back, we've got 2 more topics to cover. So we hope you'll stick with us. We'll be back in a moment. And we're back. We're going to continue to talk about some of the biggest stories of 2015. And the next category is one that you were probably waiting for, and it's the major product launches in 2015. There were a lot of things that people got excited about, and 2 in particular that we wanted to call out as really getting a lot of share of voice for this year. The first one is Windows 10.
Huge. I mean, a different spin on some of the original conversation we had about old guard technology companies trying to stay relevant in this new mobile, cloud-based future. And Windows 10 is Microsoft's first kind of reboot into staying relevant within that type of a marketplace.
The cross-device nature of this launch got a lot of people talking, and more than a few people essentially said, Microsoft's got its mojo back. You could argue that maybe they were behind the times, but sometimes it takes a lot of planning to get out in front. So to me, watching that conversation, yes, it was an enormous leap ahead. I personally feel like it was pretty deliberate and a well-paced and well-placed product launch that is going to sustain them for quite some time to come.
Yeah, especially when you consider that Microsoft is positioning Windows 10 as basically their last operating system, that they're going to continue to iterate and add features and grow this particular platform. And when you look at how all-encompassing it is, everything from your Xbox to phone, to mobile, to laptop, to tablet, to the HoloLens, that's really cool, right? When you look at it as this ubiquitous type of a platform where you can develop these applications that give different experiences depending on what kind of device that you're on. It's pretty exciting, and it's like you said, very obviously a deliberate message that they've been working on for some time. So it'll be exciting to see how that is embraced by developers in particular, because I think obviously that message or this product, if you want to call it that, is aimed at excitement around the developer community and enticing people to come and build the next round of experiences around Microsoft platforms.
Yeah, I think the adoption will be there based on the message that, kind of like you said, this is the final frontier for us, and we're going to iterate off of it, and the call has gone out, help us to iterate off of it. So that's going to be a conversation that continues and will be really exciting to follow. The other major launch this year is the Apple Watch.
The Apple Watch, yeah. Wearables. Getting reals.
For reals.
For reals.
I love this story because it just so feels like the beginning. It's not as though this particular item or this particular subset of items, because there are a lot of different watches out there. I think everybody kind of falls under the subhead of Apple Watch. There's just so much coming on this, and that's what's exciting for me. This is one that's going to get better, and the use cases are going to start to blow our minds.
Yeah, and it's interesting because the Apple Watch has been rumored for years now, and lots of competitors obviously rushed to get things out to try and beat Apple to the punch. And there's been a certain degree of success with differing products that have been out there. Obviously, Fitbit has found a great niche for themselves in the market as far as being I'm not sure if they still are at this point, but when the Apple Watch launched, they weren't able to overtake Fitbit. They were still the number one wearable producer. And with Apple entering that segment, it does bring another level of legitimacy to it. And I think we'll just continue to accelerate innovation and continue to drive future products, future features. And I enjoy my wearable. It's great, the experiences that it gives me now. But just like you said, Robyn, it really does feel like the beginning. Like everyone's still just trying to figure out exactly what it means and what you can do with this tech. And especially the numbers of sensors and things that you can integrate into it and the information that you can get. And then obviously what you can provide back as an alternative. It is exciting, and it'll be something that we'll be looking forward to here in the coming year.
So that's probably one of the most fun things to talk about, are the product launches, the compelling software and hardware. But underneath all of those conversations is our final bucket of important stuff that happened. And those are legal precedents. So we're going to put on our lawyer hats or our judicial robes, perhaps some powdered wigs. Go ahead, envision all of this, and talk about some of the really important tech precedents that have happened this year.
Yeah, no, there are definitely some big ones, especially when we look at things like the net neutrality conversation that's been happening for some time now. We're basically at a second round of legislation going and approval being sought for net neutrality rules. There's a lot happening on the legal front as people try and figure out, how does technology fit in? How do we wrap it into legislation? How do we protect people, but at the same time not infringe on freedoms? It's a very interesting philosophical puzzle.
It's a great way of putting it. Specific to the FCC rulings around net neutrality, you have to reflect on how powerful the Democratic voice has been in this conversation. And that's something that gets me a little choked up as an American on how we're able to affect this, right? John Oliver had a really huge push to make sure that his viewers and his social media followers had a voice on this. He's known for applying a humorous slant to and also a very sharp look at some of these bigger issues, which he did for net neutrality. And directly because of his broadcast on net neutrality, the site receiving comments from the public crashed. That is a beautiful democratic thing that happened. So the considerations that have gone into the conversation, I think everyone, one side or the other, should feel good about the fact that there is a lot of input on this topic in particular. I think you're seeing a lot of businesses respond to this too.
Oh yeah. Well, if you remember the original net neutrality, it was very, very heavily driven by the business side, and that's one of the big reasons why there was so much dialogue around it. There was so much, especially from what you would traditionally call the user community or the consumer community, was that the drive for net neutrality, it was obviously concerned that, because one of the basic tenets is that the people who control the internet pipes can't control what gets priority to you, that you get to consume at the same capacities and speeds and feeds as something that's maybe sponsored by the person who's providing you with that internet link. And when you have basically the fox guarding the hen house, when you have those same companies that have a vested interest in controlling that bandwidth to you, trying to formulate the rules to quote unquote protect you, obviously seems like a bit of a conflict of interest. And so I totally agree with you, Robyn. This latest go around in the dialogue and what's really happening out there in the community as people are getting themselves educated and making themselves aware of what this issue is, what it means to them in particular as an individual. It's exciting to see people participating and taking action like that.
You can't get an "I'm voted" sticker for this one, though.
No.
That's a little demotivating to know I can't get my sticker. I digress. So another really important matter that was addressed this year had to do with Google and the EU filing antitrust charges.
Very interesting.
The EU filing of antitrust charges against Google has had the outcome of individuals being able to request that Google take down information about them. This has had a tremendous impact. And I think the place that we're getting to is where who gets to say that you take something down. That's the piece that is still getting decided. Individuals, of course, have been able to successfully petition that material be removed. But to what extent do companies have an argument to make about public information being removed from the search site?
Oh, yeah. And I think the other side, the kind of like the flip side of that, in particular antitrust as well, is it kind of comes down to that same net neutrality, is that when you have an organization as large as Google that controls as much or has as much influence over the public and their internet consumption as they do, one of the big looks is that are they favoring their own services? Are they, directing people to their own internally hosted services, whether that be, for instance, I think one of the big ones was their shopping site, as opposed to sending them to, say, like a Target or some other e-retailer. So again, are they giving themselves preferential treatment when they control that much of the market is obviously a bit of a challenge. And if I remember correctly from the actual antitrust, is that they're even potentially looking at Android and to see if Google is influencing the manufacturers or OEMs of Android phones to give preferential treatment to Google apps to be pre-installed and what that means.
I mean, and I understand the reason for the argument, but can I just say, well, duh. I mean, if you buy something or if you make something that has an Android operating system, isn't that the default? I mean, we've been in this conversation before with Microsoft and Internet Explorer. Mm-hmm. This is not a new storyline.
Not at all. But I think what's interesting is the difference between the way that Microsoft obviously generated revenue versus how Google generates revenue, which is all based off of, search results and being able to provide relevant data and people basically paying Google for inclusion within advertising and promotion. And so if you now are giving yourself preference over the people who are paying you to kind of be sponsored and made more relevant, and now you're even capturing and potentially pushing that data through other applications that are getting preferred space because of your operating system on a phone. It creates a lot of stickiness and a lot of ties in there. And again, definitely not implicating that anyone's guilty or anything, but it's not hard to see how someone might be able to draw those lines and to see that connection there.
And, that argument could be made across so many operating systems, right? I mean, Google has market share on a number of... They are a verb. Google is a verb, mm-hmm. right? And I think that that's where, it has to do with share of voice. And that's why barristers in the UK had to, I think, tackle this one. Finally, and this is one that I don't think got as much coverage as I was hoping it would. It definitely did at the time. Personally, I was just hoping for more conversation on it because I think that it has some genuine impact really across a whole spectrum of things that affect our lives right now. And that's the safe harbor ruling. Safe harbor is really a conversation around how information stored overseas can be regulated, can be accessed by government, specifically government prosecutors, mm-hmm. Can be accessed by, familiar acronyms like the CIA, the NSA, mm-hmm. the FBI. And in October, this one really kind of became a challenge for the tech giants.
It did, and it's interesting to see where it came from. When you look at the source, it was originally brought up, it was a complaint made to the EU. If I remember correctly, it was from a student that was concerned about his data being stored and accessed off of Facebook. the interesting piece about this conversation to me is how does it translate to this conversation of the cloud that we've been having, throughout the course of the year. We talk about, hey, everything's moving to the cloud, everything's moving to the cloud. And, it just kind of becomes this ambiguous term, right? We even see it in our tech drawings as we kind of present these, where it's literally just this big amorphous cloud thing. Well, that cloud thing is made up of individual components of compute and storage, and that data is sitting someplace, right? And its accessibility and the legal rights to obtain and to use that information is, obviously something that it takes a lot of people and a lot of thought and a lot of law to try and understand and wrap around.
Yeah, this is why I'm still hoping to hear more conversation on this, because maybe don't separate the three conversations, right? Taken as a whole, these three issues really start to represent something much, much bigger. If you look at 2015 as having been the year of some major social rulings from our Supreme Court, I would wager that 2016 is going to be the year of technological legislation. We're going to see a lot of efforts for the way that we regulate, the way that we legislate, the way that we reprimand and protect, all be taken up by our judiciary system.
Yeah, that's an interesting prediction, especially when we consider that pretty much everybody, and chances are everyone in the sound of our voice with this podcast, has some form of a digital identity, right? I mean, we actually live a part of our existence within this digital space. And before we started recording the podcast, Robyn, you and I were talking about Oculus Rift and the integration into Facebook. Facebook is more and more becoming the way that we interact and we socialize with people, these social communities. And it's not hard to take that leap. At the time, obviously, it was pretty interesting. I think a lot of people are scratching their heads going, Oculus Rift, really Facebook? But if you look at it in the context of, hey, it's literally just taking these interactions that you're having with people on a day-to-day basis through this website or through this app and translating into something a little more personable and a little more realistic. But if we look at that from the perspective of we're literally taking our lives, that have been very analog in nature and bringing that into this more virtual space as we start having these conversations around legislation to protect, digital identities, digital data, it kind of gives it another meaning and another level of context, I think.
Yeah, and that context is what's going to be fleshing itself out over the course of I would say certainly in this coming year, we're going to see some real big moves around that. But that's another show, right? We have to do a predictions show. So it's
more of a New Year's thing.
It is. Yeah, we got to ramp up into the new year. We have to recap everything. You have to know where you've been to know where you're going.
I like what you did there.
So this has been our 2015 recap show, and we'd love to know what you think were the biggest tech stories of 2015. So find insight on LinkedIn or on Facebook or on Twitter. You can just do a quick little search for us. I guarantee you're going to find it. Let us know what story really was compelling for you this year. So until next time, indeed, until maybe even next year, I'm signing off for Technically. No, that's our digital magazine, but that's a nice plug. I'm signing off for Technomics. Robyn Ituli.
And Jeremy Nelson.
Thanks for listening. You can find all of our shows on iTunes. Join us next time for another episode of Technomics.